A look at the challenges of covering the sports beat next on Carpe Diem. Hello and welcome to Carpe Diem. I'm Marc Rosenweig, Associate Professor in the School of Communication and Media at Montclair State University. Social media is an important part of sports coverage today. I discuss social media and other key reporting platforms with a panel of professionals at the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center on the MSU campus. Our guests include Gary Honig, Editorial Director of the Players Tribune website, ESPN producer Willie Weinbaum, and Katie Tang, Social Media Manager for the Philadelphia Eagles. In part two of our discussion, I asked Katie Tang for her view on the effectiveness of various social media platforms in telling sports stories.
You pick up news on Twitter because of how real-time it is, versus Facebook, which is much more direct to the fan. It can be much more intimate. You have more than 140 characters to express yourself. But what's said on Facebook doesn't get picked up as often because it's much harder to follow athlete stories, as they're unfolding. And so I think Twitter is brilliant. Gary brought up a great point about distribution. You're able to, push links to push users to your website to read the full story, and you're able to get out these really great bite-sized stats and little news nuggets. But again, it's definitely dangerous because everything isn't real time. It has the national media's attention, and there's always someone online watching and reading and following along.
And it's not the gospel. The governor of Texas tweeted congratulations to the Houston Astros before they had won the game, and then they lost to the Kansas City Royals. So it can make people look really, really bad. And I think that the same skepticism that journalists have to have about anything somebody would say needs to apply to Twitter as well. When I was in school, I learned if your mother says she loves you, check it out. Well, the same principle applies to everything. And while we'd like to enjoy what people say, we also have to approach it with skepticism. People say things, we don't necessarily know what they say is true. We need to practice proper journalism, attribute material, vet the material, and then go from there. And it's a very different thing today when you evaluate the credibility, the quality of information. Somebody tweeting something is not the same as somebody reporting something. At least I hope not.
Katie, what is the most valuable social media stream for the Eagles? What has the most impact and why of all those 8 you talked about?
If you asked me this when I first started, it would be a much different answer. I think it depends on what our end goal is. If we're trying to connect with the fans, Facebook is great because we have 2.95 million fans on Facebook. If we want something to go viral, to get picked up by the national media, Twitter is great because one retweet from the NFL, elevates our message to 12 million more people. I think what's most intriguing right now is Snapchat, and the way teams are using it is to give fans, an inside look at practice and on game day, and really give them like an in-the-moment experience. But it is also a great way to tell a story and to share content and maybe try to turn the conversation. I think because it's so prevalent right now among young adults, they're the ones who are most likely to talk about what we're putting on there by word of mouth and to generate a buzz in that sense.
So just tell everybody who doesn't know what Snapchat focuses on compared to the others.
Sure. So Snapchat first started as a photo messaging service. They added on text chat onto their platform, but the most game-changing thing they've done to their product is create live stories. My Story, live story section, where if you take a photo, it can live on that platform for 24 hours and anyone can see it, it's public, versus their private messaging, which is much shorter shelf life. And it's been fantastic for teams, for leagues, even they can have a live store in Barcelona, any city out there, and you get transported into that city or that live story in real time.
By the way, one of the things that's really interesting is that Twitter and other platforms are a source of news, not just because they get out a message, but because of the pitfalls. The governor of Texas being one example, but when people flub a tweet or say something provocative in a tweet that's insensitive, for example, that becomes a huge story. And so I think that there are many more sources of information, but there are also more sources of reasons for skepticism and for monitoring and also for journalism. So while I think many would characterize the Players Tribune, team sites, et cetera, as marketing and PR tools, they're also the seeds of coverage for journalistic outlets. And Gary mentioned before that he'd like to see people read the Players Tribune and have that lead to different coverage. So if Gary were wearing his ESPN The Magazine cap today, he would be looking at the Players Tribune and saying, that's an interesting story. Maybe there's an angle we could do on this other player. You know, there are more resources for us to mine for story information.
I think to go to the reaction I had earlier about territoriality, when you asked me how I'd feel about it if I was there, I think you need to back off that and then say, there's never a case of something coming along, pushing everything out and nothing happening. You can read, people do these stories all the time about the response to the telegraph and how it's going to completely erode the quality of society and communication. If you go through platforms and their arrival on the scene, there's immediately this sense that it's somehow threatening everything that was there before.
Including sports radio, ESPN.
Totally.
I mean, people cried the world is going to collapse because so much attention was being devoted to sports, and it's exploded.
Right.
I mean, the people who said sports radio would not succeed, ESPN would not succeed, well, we know what the reality has been, and the question is, where are we going in the future? And I think that every individual in this room, everybody who's watching this feed, has the tools to get out a message, not necessarily for quite a wide readership or audience, but now there is this direct connection, and what does that mean? I think the significance is, again, skepticism in following that information and realizing that it's the people themselves who are providing the information, and then following up. I mean, if we're teaching a journalism class today, and we're getting to talk to a journalism class today, I would say that your job is easier in a lot of ways because you have all this access, all these ways you can find out information, but you still need to get out there. The shoe leather that Jimmy Breslin described so beautifully. You can't just sit in your room with a computer and assume that you're getting all of the truth.
Correct.
And all of the best stories. You're getting a lot of information, but you still need to get out there and pursue stories and make that personal contact with people. I would hazard a guess that for most journalists, it's the personal contact that has led to the best stories that we've ever done.
I agree 100%. I would say if you were looking at the evolution of these platforms from as if you were a journalistic biologist from an evolutionary perspective, no value judgment, right? The access to athletes has been significantly poisoned by the nature of media in the contemporary world. I mean, they just feel like, I don't want to go out there. Ask yourself whether the best way to get information from somebody is to stick a mic in his face 30 minutes after a highly adrenalized experience and while he's half naked and there are 50 other people around him. Do you really think you can build a relationship and get good information that way? Especially if you're asking the same questions every day. I've asked this question, by the way, to other people.
No, well, you need more of that. I mean,
Right.
I
Well,
can
that's
speak
to what
from
Willie's
personal
talking about.
experience covering the Miami Dolphins way back when John Shula was the coach. You would be in the sweaty locker room getting, the 20-second sound bites, but then you'd also be at practice during the week,
You have
getting
work
to
and
know
develop
Bob
those relations.
Greasy and some of the other people, and cultivate. You had to do both to be effective, even on television. And that also brings the question up. I spoke to somebody not too long ago who covers the Denver Broncos, and what she was saying is that they are restricting tweeting from practice, that they don't want people tweeting from practice anymore mean, when you talk about access and so on, if you find something out, should you have the right to distribute it right away? What's your view, Katie, on that?
A couple things. I think Gary brought up earlier that, you know, why put something out there? Why tweet something if you don't know the context around it? Don't say anything if you don't, like if someone's not practicing, you know, if someone's not practice, you don't know the context. You're watching practice. You see someone not in pads. It's like, all right, well, what's the full story there? A lot of reporters these days, they would just, you know, bring it up and say, oh, so and so isn't at practice,
And speculate, right?
right, and speculate. Oh, maybe he was injured, or maybe, you know, something else happened.
We're going to have some fireworks on this issue in a moment.
Sure, but
Warning to the audience.
and I think what's interesting is a good Philadelphia example that happened recently with Steve Mason, the goaltender of the Philadelphia Flyers. He wasn't at practice one day, and you know, reporters speculated, you know, maybe it was because he got pulled out of goal the other night, and then it wasn't found out until later on that he had a personal issue, a personal issue that took him away from Philadelphia. And so, without that context, there's a ton of speculation. You know, the media would run wild with that story. So the onus is on the reporter and the journalists themselves to report and not just tweet.
Well,
Yeah, but what
number
about the-
one, I have a huge problem with the control of the message that journalists are allowed to provide. I mean, I just hate it. The idea that a league or a team can tell journalists you can't report, well, I hate that, period. I'm a journalist, and I think we should be able to report. That doesn't mean it's always right. And we have a great example this year in New York, the Christian Flores matter, when it was tweeted that Christian Flores had been traded. You may recall.
Wilmer Flores.
I'm sorry.
Wilmer, yes.
I apologize. Wilmer Flores. And I'm a Mets fan, too.
I thought you were
so
talking
to
about a
get that
soccer
wrong-
player for a minute.
Yeah,
but
sorry
anyway,
about
yeah,
that.
it's all right.
Wilmer Flores. When Wilmer Flores was on the field playing the game, it was tweeted that he had been traded, and it was tweeted a little bit later, subject to the physicals, etc. But it went viral, and Wilmer Flores ended up in tears. It was one of the biggest stories of the year. I'm not defending the right to do it wrong. I think that journalists should get it right, and this goes back to what I said at the beginning. There should be accuracy, not just immediacy. I mean, people make mistakes. I just called Wilmer Flores Christian Flores, but I didn't tweet it, and I got corrected, thankfully, just as this got corrected. But the genie was out of the bottle, and it created a wild situation. Maybe it helped the Mets win the division, I don't know, as it turned out. So I look upon it with very fond thoughts. But I do think we have a real problem when the agencies, whatever the agency is, team, league, is telling journalists you can't report. That's a very big problem.
Well,
there should be reporting with context. I don't disagree with you. The reporting should be accurate. It should be good, but I don't think it should be restricted.
Here's the problem. They can't really restrict it. The problem is they can punish you. And that's where it gets tricky, right? They have no right to tell you what to publish. That's nonsense.
They can say you can't come back tomorrow.
They can not give you access to team players anymore. That's where your problem lies. And in the context of what you said, with all due respect to the Flyers, if that's the case, then step out and say, so-and-so's not here today. I know you're all going to think it's because he got pulled the other night, but he's got a personal problem. It's a real one. So don't publish that story because it's stupid. A little bit disclosure, a little bit of managing the story ahead of the time, and you don't have that problem. Provide the context before the fact. Think about it. Think about what your report is going to do. There is mostly this rather than this these days. I'm not speaking specifically to your case. There's a lot of this. If you talk to the Major League Players Association, for example, about efforts to get stories out or to try to do things, they'll tell you they have a 10-10-10 rule. There are 10 teams that really get it, get social media, get the need to humanize their players, get the message out. 10 teams that will listen and not always respond, and 10 teams that are just shut down and don't want anybody telling any stories that they don't completely control. That's a problem. I would say it's a commissioner's problem.
Well, and it's an honesty issue. I mean, if teams practiced what Gary prescribed, if they said from the beginning, hey, this is what's happening, this is why it's happening, report it, don't report it, whatever. I mean, honesty is unfortunately not always in great supply.
Right.
And if teams realized that by leveling with people from the beginning, they're going to get better coverage. They're not going to be at loggerhead situations with the people reporting. It would be great for everybody, but that's not the way things work. And then you factor in competitive advantage considerations when it comes to injuries, and then there's a whole gambling aspect that comes with it, gamesmanship. The atmosphere is not great for team public relations with journalists, and it's been that way for a while. And the question is, how does this phenomenon of teams having their own sites or players having their own sites, how does that affect it? Right now, probably not very well. I mean, the question is, are people going to play nice in the future? And I don't know the answer.
I'll respond to something you said earlier, which I was not in any way offended by. But when you describe, and I'm not saying it's your opinion either, so people have described it as a public relations outlet, as a control mechanism, and there hasn't been a single person who has written that's actually picked up the phone and said, you know, that guy Honig, he's been in the business a long time. Maybe I'll ask him how they actually get this done. Maybe I can find out about the process.
Well, you just led to my next question.
Are you
okay?
reporting or are you just
No,
accommodating?
what I want to do is spend a couple of minutes with everybody and look at one of the stories you were involved with that caused a lot of controversy, not necessarily for you, but for Mets fans, and that's the Matt Harvey pitch limitation story, okay? And the story, very quickly, for those who are not
I was
aware
going to
of
stay
it.
with that because something he said about
What?
practice, when he talked about practice, it's interesting to see how Matt's reputation gets affected.
Yeah,
by that.
Matt Harvey supposedly has pitch limitations because of his Tommy John surgery. He comes out and has a dispute with the Mets, or his agent does, and I'm kind of truncating the whole story. And then he does a news conference that doesn't go over real well, and people feel that.
Yeah, he's befuddled. He answers impulsively.
Yeah, he doesn't.
And by the way, he's also a guy who participated in an hour-long documentary for ESPN earlier, so he's a guy who's certainly out there in the media. It's not like he's never spoken with any media outlet, and now he's all of a sudden speaking with a platform that's for the players only. I mean, there are many layers to the Matt Harvey story.
But whatever you can tell us about the backstory, obviously he was trying to do image repair by doing that, by contributing a story to your website, and he already had an affiliation with your website to explain more clearly. And I think most people responded well to it, but he had some damage control to do there, right?
Right. So what are the options in the conventional structure there? What would you advise him? He's already affiliated with us.
Right.
So he has a platform where he can speak. Theoretically, he could have had a press conference where he could have done the same thing, right? But that's a significantly more complicated context with 100 people, with all those folks out there.
And less control.
Right. So the message here is hardly complicated, right? He's a 26-year-old kid. If you really look at the context of the story, 26-year-old kid who's coming back from major surgery. He's been told to watch out for his pitch count. The Mets have gone into this season, as you know, Willie, with no expectation of getting to where they are now, or very little. He gets to that limit, and I have no comment about Scott, but when he went at Boris, I'm talking about his agent. Not sure that making this argument in the public is such a great idea, but there's a dispute at this point between the Mets and his management about pitch count. Now, you know that there's a 6-year rule in terms of how long Major League Baseball teams get to control their own signees, right? So there is an incentive, like it or not, for a professional baseball team to use up a player before those 6 years are gone, because then he's a free agent. The better he is, the more arm he has left, the more money he's going to get.
And they've also kept people in the minor leagues longer to
Chris
control them
Bryant.
longer.
Right.
Chicago Cubs. Big story this year.
So you're 26, and there are tens of millions of dollars lying on the table that are about whether you can continue to pitch at this level. And suddenly you're thrust into the middle of this. To say that you are confused or don't know what the right thing to do is hardly a major revelation. Did he deal with it well? No, I'm not sure anybody would have dealt with it well in New York. I mean, maybe Derek, but not many people deal with it very well. Is it that complicated to say? See, I don't really know what the right. Did he say what I wish he'd have said? And this is off the record. I wish he said more. I wish he said what I'm saying. This is hard. I don't know what to do. I want to see these guys win. I want to go and pitch in the World Series. Who wouldn't want to do that? But I don't want to lose the chance of my career continuing.
But in this instance, you already had an affiliation with him. Did you reach out to him and say, maybe maybe you can clarify,
We
and this
mutually
can be,
reached out to, we did ask about it, obviously, because we are in that sense just like any other news outlet. When there's, and certainly that's something I brought to the table, which is to say, this is an important story. You're in the middle of it. If you want to clarify your position in the middle of the story, you have our platform to use it. I'm not pressing you to do it, but if you want to do it, please do.
Question, in terms of being like any other news outlet, isn't the difference though, he has ultimate say as to what gets into the publication, or is it your
I
say?
only meant it in terms of trying to be timely. I didn't mean that we were actually as scrupulous about what you're about to ask, no.
Okay,
Right, there is
so-
a difference, of course.
Right, so he approves what goes out.
Yes, absolutely, he does. But the piece of it that I'm trying to add to this, and I'm not trying to claim a credibility that you have at all, is that we urge candor, and we go back and forth with him. If anything he's saying appears false to us, or if it feels, we push back. Do we always win? No, I've pushed back on writers who've said silly things, and they've insisted on keeping them in stories. But there is a process. That's the part I was asking about, but nobody's asked me about the process. What do? We do try to make it an honest process. Is it the same process? No, but it's the same process in the sense that if you were out on a limb on a story, and I thought as your editor you were, I'd say, I don't think you want to say that, Willie. I don't think you've got it. You might fight me on it, but you'd have the final say in the end as the person whose byline's going on the story. So there are more similarities than you think. I'm not trying to claim the credibility of your unit in ESPN, but there are plenty of units in ESPN I'd be happy to claim a shared credibility with.
now in this case though, his story, his account, his explanation of his stance was basically well received, and it served a purpose, correct?
Yeah, I'd say that's true, except the press continues a narrative about Matt that went into him missing practice the other day. It's a deal. It's a dumb thing to do. I don't know what he did. I have no idea, by the way. I didn't go to him and say, clarify that. It didn't seem worth it.
Why not?
Well, because it didn't seem, to me, it seemed like a big deal.
Yeah.
Let it go. I don't want to, there's no need to stick your hand up in the air every time something happens. But that narrative continues that he's a selfish kid, only cares about himself. And I think to some degree, that's a false narrative.
And I will tell you that it was really interesting seeing the reaction to his E60 program. Many people I know came away thinking this is a selfish guy who's only out for himself, and that wasn't my view. When I watched it, I thought this is a pretty smart guy who realizes I've got a certain window of opportunity. I'm the one who has to look out for myself, and I'm going to maximize my opportunity. So everything can be interpreted different ways. And one of the things that I find really interesting is Gary pointed out that he would have liked for Harvey to say, I don't know. And those words you almost never hear out of an athlete's mind, out of an athlete's mouth, rather, even if it's in the athlete's mind. Just as when Serena Williams was approaching the Grand Slam, hadn't been done since Steffi Graf, she would never acknowledge the pressure that she was facing. Even after she lost, she didn't acknowledge the pressure. And I would have thought that if she said, there's a lot of pressure, but I know I can handle it, it would have been a much more authentic way to deal with it. And
Well,
she's taken a lot of criticism
It might have helped her
for that.
psychologically, because you
Absolutely.
could see she was spent at that point.
Yeah, and I think with Harvey, with Serena Williams, with athletes, what you want them to do is to acknowledge what they're really thinking, what they're really experiencing. And I think Gary's outlet is a way for them to do that, but even Gary's outlet isn't always going to get that, because ultimately it's what these athletes say, not necessarily what they think.
Right, you drive for what you can get, which is true, by the way, with any story. But I was just
Absolutely.
thinking, let's take the context of what you just said about Steffi. Russell Martin was asked about something he learned from Derek, right? And he said, Derek go into a game and he'd go up to bat and some guy blow 395 mile an hour fastballs past him. And he'd come back to the bench and he'd say, this guy ain't got it. And Russell said, everybody thought, man, that guy, he's not backing down from anybody, right? He's lying. That guy just put it right by him, right? He's basically saying, I'm never going to confess to any weakness. And because my responsibility of captain of the team, I've never asked Derek about this. I have no idea what the veracity of the story is. But when you look at it as a baseball fan, forgetting anything else, right, you're saying, yeah, right? He's not backing down, right? So what's Steffi doing, basically? Saying, I'm not going to admit that
Serena.
all right, Serena, right? Why would she admit that if in the context of being an athlete, admitting to that weakness begins to destroy the holistic nature of how you approach your profession?
Well, it's also subject to interpretation. Billie Jean King called pressure a privilege, and her way was to confront it even publicly. And what I would wonder is, on a site where the team is in control, to what degree is the material from the individuals and then vetted by the team, and to what degree are we getting information directly from the individuals? What is your process when a player, let's say, says to you, you know what, I'd love to talk about what I've been doing in the off season. What then happens? What is the flow chart of information from that first discussion of what the athlete's doing to the consumer being able to read it?
Right. That's a great question. I think that's one of the big advantages that teams have, which is we are in the office every day. We see them at lunch at the cafeteria. We go to the same salad bar. And so we get to build that relationship with the players that's off the field, that's out of the locker room. They can, we build that trust with them because we're colleagues in that sense. And so if they have a story that they want to tell, we have a great writing staff. We have 3 writers on staff who, we've done a couple different content types where we'll do first-person stories. Players will, share their story to one of our writers. It's an as told by story. And then we also, do interviews and we write off of that. And so there are a number of ways to tell one player's story, and we build that trust with the source as well as with the readers that they are getting accurate, honest portrayal of, what we've been told.
And then does the team, are there officials above the journalists involved, the writers involved? And I know you consider yourself a journalist and you have journalistic training, but there are other people, general managers, let's say, training staff who might say, I don't know, that may be a little more information than I'd like out there. What is the pushback on the material?
I think what's good is that as a writing staff, as a social media staff, we have expectations set out for us as to what are the messages we're trying to convey to our fans, what's the story of the Philadelphia Eagles that we want to tell, and we're able to work within those parameters and tell the story the way we see fit.
Editing will always be a controversial topic on any beat. Thanks to our panelists, and special thanks to Dave Kaplan, director of the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center, for co-sponsoring the panel. For more information on this or any edition of Carpe Diem, contact us at carpediem@mail.montclair.edu or call 973-655-5158. I'm Marc Rosenweig. For all of us at Montclair State University, thanks for watching Carpe Diem.